Hello and welcome to part 2 of the Exam number 1 review presentation for the course Instructional Design. In this particular sort of review, I'm going to be presenting some of the real basic fundamental information associated with the notes that you have on Instructional Design Basics. And I'm going to use as sort of a common example or common theme for this presentation something that was reflected upon and presented in part 1 of this review, the much lengthier video, dealing with our project goal. And if you recall, the project goal has to do with some level of appreciating something, or you as a designer trying to do something instructionally to affect the level of appreciation that somebody might have over anything that you choose. And it could be appreciating jazz music or some form of dance or some form of visual art, whether it's paintings or photography or fashion. Even something like being able to appreciate a good bottle of wine is something that you could address in your goal. And well, and appreciating wine. And wine, oh dear, hold on a second. Okay, and we're back. What I'm going to be presenting on, though, in terms of an appreciation example for this short presentation, is the idea of helping learners appreciate something about the Civil War. So let's start with a very broad goal statement, or it could either be a broad goal statement or a learning objective associated with an even bigger goal. But let's just take one, appreciating the importance of the Civil War. So perhaps you're a teacher in American history at some grade level that addresses any outcomes associated with the Civil War. So regardless of what the actual learning outcomes might be on some set of learning standards from a textbook or from some kind of a state standards listing, you as a teacher might have as one of your learning objectives that you want your students to appreciate the importance of the Civil War. But of course, as with your very first project or associated with the big course project, I'm asking you to consider, what does it mean to appreciate the importance of something? What does it mean in terms of how can you tell somebody appreciates the importance of something? How can you tell? Because in this class, you are going to be designing experiences that specifically address a change in behavior for people that demonstrates to you as the designer that they can do the thing, or that they have learned what you want them to learn. So for example, one way to reframe appreciating the importance of the Civil War is to consider that you might want to help your students learn how to explain how problems in American society that contributed to the cause or causes of the Civil War continue to affect people in American society today. That might be one of the ways that if somebody can do this, you might be able to say as an educator or as an instructional designer that if they can do this, they can at least appreciate the importance of the Civil War, because you're drawing a line between understanding or explaining how the Civil War or the actions and factors or variables associated with the cause of the Civil War continue to have a pretty big impact on American society today. So that is one way of appreciating how important the Civil War was and perhaps continues to be. Another way that you could consider whether or not somebody appreciates something is that they would choose to do something about that thing at some point in their life outside of the instruction. And so you might have as a goal or as an objective that the learners would choose to learn more about the Civil War. They would make that choice. In doing so, they would be demonstrating for you that they appreciate how important it is. Again, these are decisions that you as a designer make when you try to operationalize an important learning outcome. In this case, appreciate. And by the way, when I use the term operationalize, I am referring to describing something in terms of how you know you have it. And so that's what operationalize means in that context. Okay, and just before I begin presenting some real quick information about the learning outcomes that are going to be measured on the first course exam associated with basic instructional design, I just want to remind you that these basic skills that are being communicated here, at least the information associated with them, are all leading to the design of an effective learning environment. And again, I'll emphasize this again. You're going to be tasked with the very big challenge of trying to develop a learning experience that helps somebody appreciate something. That's quite a challenge. So the lion's share of your efforts in this class are going to be at the design phase, but like one thing you're going to be learning a lot more about is when you sit down to design something, you have to know precisely what it is you are designing. You need to know what the end product is. You have to have that in your mind so that you can make all the best decisions in the design process, because all of those decisions are based on specifically what it is you want people to be able to learn. And you can only tell if they learn something excuse me, if their behavior changes in a way that is indicative of that learning. So, objectives are the roadmap on the journey, and so if you're heading out on a long journey and you know that you have a destination in mind, then having a clear roadmap in terms of getting from point A to point B is something that's really important. And also, this is actually a pretty good analogy too, because there are many different routes that you can take to get from point A to point B. Absolutely. But the point is, you have your destination always in mind when you're on that journey. And so learning objectives are at the absolute heart of instructional design basics. So in terms of the notes that are presented in the course, there are 8 outcomes associated with instructional design basics. And for exam number 1, for the first course exam, you are only responsible for being able to perform the first 6 of that list. And all of these address in some way learning outcomes or instructional objectives. And so that's what I'm going to be communicating about here in this brief presentation. So please note that you will learn more about the other objectives. They're very important, but they're not going to be measured on the first course exam. So you're going to be focusing your attention in terms of preparing for the exam on the objectives from part 1 that were addressed explicitly in the previous video, and also the 6 objectives that are indicated here that are not italicized and not sort of faded out. So the first 6. And so I am going to now briefly present to you some information and examples associated with each of these. And I want to encourage you again to refer to the course notes explicitly for each of these outcomes. I'm just going to be sort of talking about them briefly so you get a better understanding of some of the important general characteristics of these objectives. Okay, so one of the things you're going to have to demonstrate on the exam is your ability to distinguish between a performance outcome and an instructional objective. And by the way, the reason why this is important is because you use performance outcomes to help you make decisions about what strategies are best when you design something, but you use instructional objectives to ensure that those strategies are implemented properly within the parameters of your learning environment, and that is actually the big difference. And so let me just give you some examples of the difference here between what a performance outcome is and what an objective is. So the performance outcome just explains or communicates the actual skill that you want somebody to be able to learn, the skill, knowledge, or attitudes. The instructional objective expands on that by communicating the conditions under which the learning will be measured, as well as some indication of how you know that somebody has learned something, what level of performance is acceptable for you to say, yes, that does constitute actual learning. So it's just an example of the difference. A performance outcome associated with mathematics would be that students will add double-digit numbers together. So that's the skill that you want the learners to be able to perform. But an instructional objective, again, it expands on that by specifying classroom conditions under which the performances or behaviors will occur while they're being practiced and while they're being assessed, as well as any criteria that the learners must meet to indicate that they can actually do that. So in this case, the instructional objective is given two double-digit numbers written in equation form. The learners or the students will add them together. In this case, and something you'll learn more about in the course notes, there is no standard listed or described for this instructional objective because one isn't really necessary. They can either add them together properly or they can't. You might include the fact that you're not going to be having numbers that have decimals or something, but that would be part of the condition and not part of the standard. And again, this may sound a little abstract to you if you've never worked with instructional objectives before, but as I indicated, the course notes has some important information about all of this. So another example that's not one that I'm writing down here, but going back to the first video I talked about, I used a little toddling little baby as an example of a living organism or a creature, an animal, a human that likely does not possess a particular skill set associated with being able to read. But at the end of a certain amount of time and at the end of a certain amount of instructional intervention, you might have a goal or a set of objectives associated with that learner or that child being able to read. So an outcome, a performance outcome, might be that by the time a learner is, I won't include any standard or condition yet. I'll just say, so being able to read at a particular level might be the performance outcome. Say we'll read at a second grade level, whatever that means. And actually, a second grade level would be a standard that I'm imposing. So I guess the best objective or the best performance outcome is that the learners will be able to read. The instructional objective would be that the learners would be able to read, by second grade, the learners would be able to read one or more of the following books and adequately summarize the content of the book for you. So that's a big, giant instructional objective that is much more precise, much more specific than the performance outcome, which is just that they'll be able to read. So essentially, if you want to know the difference between a performance outcome and an instructional objective, typically the instructional objectives are going to be written much more elaborately and they're going to be longer. Now, in some cases, there isn't any difference between the two. For example, the learners will be able to define the term learning. That's an instructional objective that I have for this class. It's also a performance outcome because it explains what the skill is, but it doesn't have any condition or any standard because it's a verbal information skill and it doesn't need either of those. So that in that case, they would be the same. All right, the next objective is you're being able to categorize individual performance outcomes as one or more, as one of these types: knowledge, intellectual skills, cognitive strategies, psychomotor, or attitudes. And I just want to direct your attention to the fact that in the course notes there is a key, what we call a dichotomous key, to help you in your mind walk through the steps in determining whether or not, or what type of outcome is communicated in a performance outcome, what type of skill, knowledge, or attitude. So I just want to, again, direct your attention to the fact that in the course notes you have this scaffold, this tool that helps you think about the difference between the different types of performance outcomes and how you might classify them. Okay, another thing that maybe has gone unsaid up to this point in the course is that you have to make a lot of decisions as a designer about what outcomes you think are important for the learners to learn. Now, sometimes those decisions are, in many cases, made for you by having a list of standards or outcomes that are given to you by a client or by an administration who says to you, here's the course, these are the course outcomes, we're using this text, etc. That does not mean, by the way, if you get a list of outcomes that you still don't have to make decisions, because anytime as an educator you're given a list of outcomes, you might identify as a good designer the fact that there are other outcomes that need to be learned or that are more important to be learned that should also be part of the learning experience and should also be part of the goal of the learning experience. So this is an important skill. And when you're trying to identify which is more worthwhile when you're given two skills, or related skills, I should say, you have to address four points to help you determine which it might be more worthwhile. So the first one is whether or not the skill itself is the learners will use it in their life outside the instructional environment. Will they have an opportunity to practice and apply that skill in their real world? And their real world, by the way, might include what's the next level of their education. But that's the real world. The most important factor right there. Is it something that they'll use out in the real world? Another factor is whether or not it's a skill that's required in order to acquire other more useful skills, knowledge, or attitudes. And so you might have a skill set, you might be facilitating a skill set that doesn't seem as if it's the most worthwhile in and of itself, but it might be requisite for other skills. So going back to the reading analogy, for example, there might be some sort of phonics, learning about how to sound out certain letter combinations that may be contrived in some way, where combinations or two-letter combinations that don't show up as two-letter combinations in the real world very often, but when you're trying to help somebody learn how to read, you know that something like that might be foundational for learning how to decode words or sentences made of words, etc. So that's another important characteristic that you ask yourself. Another characteristic is whether or not it's something that you as a teacher want your students to be able to use in their real lives. You want them to. They may not actually face applying those skills, but you want them to. And there's a reasonable expectation that they will have an opportunity to use those skills if they want. That's really important. So for those of you who are doing projects where you're addressing art skills, many art skills are not something that people face every single day, but you would want them to, and they could, and there's a reasonable opportunity for them to do it at any given time, and that certainly makes it worthwhile. It's hard to apply that same criterion to something like having to learn the bonding angles of certain types of molecular structures in an organic chemistry class. It's again, I'm still waiting for an opportunity to apply that particular skill in my world, in my real life. And finally, one very important criterion is that it's something that learners want to use in their real life. That certainly makes it worthwhile. So even though you as a teacher might be making decisions based on your assumptions of what's worth learning from the learner's perspective, their perception matters as well. And so that obviously makes it worthwhile. It may not be an important criterion when you're trying to decide in terms of what skills are important in a learning environment and you don't know who the learners are exactly, then that you might not consider that, but it definitely needs to be included on the list. All right, now we have the last two outcomes for this short presentation are ginormous ones, difficult to do, a lot more difficult than you think, but I'll just present it here. And then again, I'm going to encourage you to make sure you do as much practice over this as you can, and I'll be providing some of that for the course. But the two objectives are, if you're given a variety of statements, identify which meet the criteria for well-written objectives, and then also write worthwhile, well-written objectives, goals and objectives. And by the way, in case you're wondering, I don't differentiate goals, instructional goals, from instructional objectives very clearly, other than to say that in general, instructional goals are much more ambitious and address sort of skill sets that are a little bit, have broader application than individual instructional objectives. But in terms of writing them, from a design perspective, there isn't much difference. And so I don't make a big deal about differentiating between those two. Okay, so let me just do a short presentation then on what characteristics do constitute a well-written instructional objective. So I'm going to go back to my Civil War example here. I'll finish out with that. So here I have a well-written objective that relates to the goal that I contrived, and I will say that in blue that would be the condition. That's what's going to be given to the learners when they have to actually perform this skill. So what they're going to be given is a current issue that affects race, class, and or local, regional, or national disparity that's observed in America today. So they're given that. That's the condition. The outcome is that they will analyze and explain how these issues relate to variables that likely contributed to causes of the Civil War. That's the skill I want them to be able to do. Now, I didn't include a standard on this because it's a fairly broad statement, and a standard, I might have standards that I would include later, I suppose, on what would constitute an acceptable answer to that question, or I should say an acceptable response when they're analyzing and explaining. But standards are only needed when it's absolutely necessary. So let's take a look at another outcome associated with the Civil War that relates to attitudes, and that is very specific, that the learners will choose to view Ken Burns' Civil War documentary sometime in the future. How's that for an outcome? It's actually well written. In red, it has the performance outcome. They're going to choose to view that documentary. That's a choice. That's an attitude. And what's in green would be the criteria, and the criteria is, or the standard is sometime in the future. I didn't say next week. I didn't say by the end of the semester or anything. It's an attitude. It's a choice that the learners will make of their own volition. It's something that, as a teacher, I won't be able to measure likely, unless I measure it in a contrived fashion by asking them a attitude question on an exam or on a quiz that says something like, what is the likelihood that you will view Ken Burns' Civil War documentary sometime in the future? And they can indicate their likelihood, level of likelihood. I suppose I should qualify it by saying that it's something like 8 hours long or something like that. So anyway, that's a well-written objective as well. The course notes provide examples of well-written and poorly written objectives. Generally speaking, when people write objectives, they tend to fall into the poorly written trap all the time by being too ambiguous and using terminology that you don't use when you're talking about good instructional objectives. For example, the learners will understand the causes of the Civil War. That's a poorly written objective because the word understand can mean too many different things. Also, poorly written objectives use a lot of superfluous language, like students will learn about the Civil War. First of all, learning about is a given. I mean, you're describing instruction. You're not describing the outcomes of instruction. And also, if you think about it, the students will learn about the Civil War. There isn't any outcome. Even there's no performance outcome stated in that sentence. So that's poorly written in many ways. And I provide some other examples in the course notes. So make sure you study those well, and also don't forget to take the practice exam as well.